helping us
Thanks, Wolf.
appreciate the enormity of this situation right now. Let's get some more on all of this. Democratic Congressman Denny Heck of Washington State is joining us. He's a member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, so when the Justice Department hands over these Comey memos, will that be the first time you, as a key member of the Intelligence Committee, will be able to actually read them?
Yes, and I'm looking forward to entering the reading room in the SCIF at the third floor underneath the U.S. Capitol and doing just that.
The SCIF is a very confidential room that can't be monitored. Are you frustrated, Congressman, that your committee's investigation ended without every member of your committee, the House Intelligence Committee, reading those Comey memos?
Well, I'm way beyond frustrated with where we are vis-a-vis the U.S. House of Representatives' effort to get at the truth behind Russian interference in the 2016 election and the possibility of collusion, coordination, and conspiracy with either Mr. Trump or agents on his behalf. But the fact of the matter is it's not over with. Both the Mueller investigation will continue, and will some of our efforts. As I think I've indicated to you earlier, the gentleman that used to work for Cambridge Analytica has agreed in principle to come and talk with us about what it is he knew when he knew it with respect to the use of that data. So there will be efforts that continue.
When members of Congress get these Comey memos, how do you think they'll be used politically?
Well, good question. Very good question, Wolf. I don't know that I would say that the U.S. House has the best track record with respect to keeping these kinds of things confidential, but it's my hope that they will do so. I have no idea what the impact will be on my colleagues, not having seen the content. But one thing's for sure, and we know this as a fundamental legal principle, notes that are taken contemporaneously have a higher degree of probity in a legal consideration or in a legal action than other kinds of evidence, so that we'll take them very seriously and read them very carefully.
The president, as you know, was very angry that Comey, he was very angry with Comey for not saying publicly he wasn't a target in this investigation. Now, our own Jim Acosta is reporting that the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, told President Trump the other day he's not a target of the Michael Cohen investigation that's going on in New York City. What's your reaction to that?
I think the Michael Cohen document and computer seizure is probably the most significant thing that has happened in the entire affair over the last 14 months, even though it's not directly related. But I think actually, Wolf, what we ought to do is we ought to construct the Michael Cohen flip index. And on a scale from 1 to 100, determine not the likelihood that he'll flip, but the number of years of sentencing he is facing and the point at which he will flip. My own personal bet, were I a betting man, is if, and it's a if yet to be determined, if he confronts between 10 and 15 years in jail, then he's going to sing like a canary.
But he hasn't yet been charged with anything. We know he's the target of a criminal investigation, but he still hasn't been charged. We don't know what crimes he might be charged with, do you?
No, I don't, and that's why I said if, and that's important to extend that to Michael Cohen. He has not yet been indicted, but I have to believe that given that the court approved the search warrant, that the Southern District of the Department of Justice and FBI had a pretty good reason for going in there. So we'll see, and he may not yet be indicted, but you have to believe that there was substantial foundation for them to seek the warrant and for them to follow up with this.
Just last night, Congressman, this is what President Trump said about Rod Rosenstein and Robert Mueller. Listen to this.
As far as the two gentlemen you told me about, they've been saying I'm going to get rid of them for the last 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, and they're still here. So we want to get the investigation over with, done with, put it behind us.
You think that Rod Rosenstein telling the president he's not a target in the Michael Cohen investigation bought both of these men, Rosenstein and Mueller, some time?
Well, it's hard to take the president at his word, Wolf, that he wants this investigation to be completed when you consider how erratic he has been on the subject of whether or not he would sit for an interview or a deposition with the Mueller investigation per se. He at one point said, sure, I'd be glad to do that. And then the lawyer started suggesting that maybe that would not be in his best interest because he might say something that would self-incriminate. And he now seems to be in a position of either extremely restrictively qualifying his willingness to participate or just denying it, prohibiting it altogether. So it's a little hard to take him at his word that he wants this over with when he's not cooperating.
Congressman, I want you to stand by for a moment. I'm going to get your reaction. Our own Pamela Brown is back with us. She has more breaking news on some new additions to the president's legal team. Pamela, what else are you learning?
Well, Rudy Giuliani just spoke with the Washington Post, and we're getting some excerpts of the conversation he had with the Washington Post reporter explaining his decision to join President Trump's legal team. And this is what he said as in terms of the reason of why he's joining the team. He says, "I'm doing it because I hope we can negotiate an end to this for the good of the country and because I have high regard for the president and for Bob Mueller." He goes on to say, "My advice on Mueller has been this. He should be allowed to do his job. He's entitled to do his job." Rudy Giuliani coming in at a crucial time in the investigation because the president's legal team, Wolf, has been trying to make the decision on whether it will allow the president to sit down and do an interview with Robert Mueller's team. As we reported last week, the raid on the president's personal attorney's office and home sort of threw all of that up in the air. And so now Rudy Giuliani is joining the team along with two other attorneys, Wolf. This is according to Jay Sekulow, one of the president's attorneys, saying that Jane Serene Raskin and Marty Raskin, a husband and wife, will also be joining the legal team. So that is three lawyers we're learning about that will be joining the team. Rudy Giuliani, as well as Jane Raskin and Marty Raskin, who are attorneys in Florida. Wolf?
Very interesting stuff, and very interesting what the president told the Washington Post. Stand by for a moment. I want to get Congressman Denny Heck's reaction. What's your reaction when he says that Mueller should be allowed, this is Rudy Giuliani, Mueller should be allowed to do his job. He's entitled to do his job. Does that suggest to you he's going to be able to sit down and interview the president?
Well, first of all, I agree with Mr. Giuliani. I think that Mr. Mueller ought to be allowed to conclude his work. Secondly, however, I received that information with great skepticism. I feel a little bit like it's Lucy with the football to Charlie Brown, going to be pulled away at the very last minute. That's been the history of this investigation thus far. There's no reason why the president couldn't have sat down, except for the revolving door of attorneys. I mean, Wolf, the number of attorneys that the president has asked to be on his team and turned him down, or the number of attorneys he's had on his team that then walked or were fired, constitutes about the size of the entire state bar in a couple of small states.
Congressman Denny Heck, thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome, sir.
There's more breaking news we're following. President Trump is said to be consumed by the criminal probe of his longtime personal lawyer and friend, Michael Cohen, in New York City. We're learning new details of what the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, told President Trump about the investigation in recent days.
The Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer, brought to you